In the end, it was when I was, say, 2 or 3 bodies under the floorboards began to accumulate that come the summer, it got hot, and I knew it'd be a smell problem.
How many bodies did you have under the floor at any given time? And he looked me up and down, he said, I don't know. He said, I never did a stock check.
The following video contains graphic and disturbing content which may be upsetting for some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. Dennis Nilsen was born on November 23, 1945, in a town called Fraserburgh. Located on the rugged coastlines of Aberdeenshire in Scotland, it's a large fishing port on the edge of the fierce and treacherous North Sea. His heritage was a mix of Norse and Gaelic, his father Norwegian and his mother Scottish. Dennis grew up in a military household, and his father's sense of duty often left his mother as the sole caregiver for Dennis and his 2 siblings. The strain of these prolonged absences eventually led to their parents' divorce. To Dennis, this experience played out a bit like a tragic slow-motion movie, where his father's presence in the family script was reduced scene by scene, his absences gradually extending until one day he simply didn't return. As a child, Dennis found an anchor in one particular family member, his grandfather. A fisherman by trade, Dennis's grandfather had a major role in shaping his early years. But this cornerstone of stability, it seems, was not as it appeared on the surface. Dennis has since shared experiences that cast a shadow over this bond. Dennis recalls being taken to unfamiliar places, remote locations far from home, and drinking what his grandfather called tea. The after effects left him dizzy and open to inappropriate touching. His grandfather, the one who bathed him and tucked him into bed, perpetuated this abuse, escalating it over time. This paradoxical relationship left Dennis confused. The only source of affection and warmth in his life was also the instigator of inexplicable pain. When his grandfather succumbed to a heart attack while at sea, it was confusing for Dennis. As per traditional customs, his body was brought home and a wake arranged in his honor. The harsh truth was concealed from the children, and Dennis thought maybe his grandpa was sleeping or feeling unwell. The next day, his grandfather was gone, and Dennis didn't know why. He didn't know what going to a better place meant, or where heaven was located. As he matured, Dennis often found himself daydreaming about his grandfather's death. He had secretly yearned for his grandfather's absence, but when it came to be, he was faced with a void. The duality of his feelings confused Dennis. He yearned for the affection his grandfather showed him, yet failed to comprehend the contradictions within his actions. This confusion would later morph into complex beliefs about the relationship between love and death. Dennis turned into a reserved and distant teenager, desiring solitude over the company of friends. His preferred companions were the animals he cared for, primarily birds and rabbits. His mother forbid animals in the house, and the rabbit died from exposure to the cold winter, the birds falling victim to the unruly neighborhood boys. Dennis constantly struggled with a sense of alienation, unaware of its cause. His emotions began to manifest in unfamiliar ways. He found himself captivated by the depiction of a boy in a French painting that he discovered in history class. He developed a crush on a classmate, but never dared approach him. Nilsen confessed to an attempt to touch his older brother while he slept, but he was overcome by fear and swore never to attempt it again. As soon as he was old enough, he joined the army, where his feelings were further repressed. He was a cook, but became very interested in filmography and befriended a subordinate who shared this interest, a man called Terry. They would film movies, acting as the cast, producers, and directors. Dennis says he would replay these films in private, especially the parts where Terry would pretend to be dead or sleeping. Dennis also developed a fascination with his own form, enjoying the detachment of seeing himself headless and unmoving in a mirror. He started to apply talcum powder to himself, wanting to appear more pale. He remained in the military for 27 years, progressed to the rank of corporal, and even performed in military ceremonies for the Queen. While stationed in Germany, he had some sexual experiences with both men and women, as the attitude at the time was more relaxed in other parts of Europe. He still had intense feelings for Terry, but Terry did not feel the same way in return. Terry eventually left the military and got married. Dennis was depressed for years, and this contributed to him leaving the military in 1972. Returning home, he fell out with his family after only a few months. His mother was concerned about him being unmarried, and his brother outed him as gay. He had very little contact with his family for the remainder of his life, and never spoke to his brother again. He moved to London and became a police officer. Dennis remained in the force for only 1 year. He mistakenly thought it might give him the same feeling of brotherhood that the military did. He also started to feel a growing sense of resentment towards authority. In early 1972, British soldiers shot 26 unarmed protesters in Northern Ireland, an event dubbed Bloody Sunday. This would later inspire the band U2 to write Sunday Bloody Sunday, and would impact Dennis's view on what he saw as an emerging police state that he wanted no part of. He would work sporadically in security before eventually getting a job in civil service. He worked for nearly a decade at a job center, helping unemployed people find work. He became very active in trade unions and often volunteered for overtime, throwing himself into work to escape his oppressive loneliness. He was unable to maintain any sort of long-term relationship, and his dog Bleep seemed to be his only companion. He spent a lot of time alone at his flat at 195 Melrose Avenue. He would frequent clubs and bars, but the resulting casual encounters he found unfulfilling and, quote, soul-crushing. He could not find the companionship and love he wanted. Either the encounters were fleeting from the start, or he was rejected quickly. His mirror fetish continued, and he started applying more elaborate makeup to simulate a corpse-like appearance complete with fake injuries. On the 30th of December 1978, 14-year-old Stephen Holmes had unsuccessfully attempted to buy alcohol at the Cricklewood Arms pub. An already drunk Dennis saw him and, thinking he was maybe 17, invited the boy to his flat. He told Stephen that they would have some drinks and listen to music. They got very drunk and passed out before Dennis could initiate any intimacy. When Dennis woke up, he found the boy sleeping next to him and was overcome with the thought that the boy would wake and then leave. He wanted to spend the holiday with him, no matter if Stephen wanted to or not. Ultimately, Stephen would not leave the flat for nearly 8 months. Dennis took a tie from his wardrobe and slipped it over Stephen's head, pulling it tighter and tighter until Stephen stopped moving. He found a bucket and filled it with water, pushing Stephen's head under until there were no more bubbles coming up. He then took him to the bathtub, stripping and bathing him, before laying him on the mattress and covering him with the bedding, as if he was merely sleeping. The enormity of what he had just done weighed on Dennis, and he took a walk to clear his head. Passing a shop, he stopped in and bought a large cooking pot and an electric knife. When he returned to the flat, he dressed Stephen and laid next to him on the bed, caressing him. Dennis admitted that he felt a sense of excitement from this, but by that time Stephen had turned cold, and, after noticing this, Nilsen found himself unable to continue. Stephen's body quickly entered rigor mortis, a state of stiffness following death. Dennis simply propped him up against the wall and waited for it to pass. Seeking a place to keep Stephen's body, Nilsen decided on the cold space beneath the floorboards of his flat, while he contemplated how he would deal with the aftermath of his first murder. Stephen's body remained there for a week before Nilsen removed it. He then proceeded to carefully wash him. Dennis then positioned Stephen in different ways while he performed lewd acts on himself. He thinks about the electric knife and cooking pot once again, but finds himself unable to cut the boy's pale, unbroken skin. He wraps him in some window drapes and places him back under the floorboards. Months pass and no one looks for the boy. Dennis is constantly surprised that there's no knock at his door, no questions at the pub, and no newspaper articles or flyers. In those days, people often burned garbage as a routine task, so Nilsen made the grim decision to dispose of Stephen's body in the same manner, reducing him to ashes in a fire. but all anyone smelled was the burning tire that Dennis had placed on top. On October 11, 1979, Nilsen met a young man from Hong Kong who was studying in London. After some drinks at a pub, Nilsen invited Andrew Ho back to his flat. There, the discussion turned to rough sex, and Dennis was happy to oblige. Dennis put a necktie on Andrew and started to pull, tighter and tighter, and Andrew realized that Dennis wasn't going to stop. He grabbed the nearest item he could see, a candle holder, and hit Dennis in the head with it. He was then able to break away and escape from the flat. He reported the incident to the police, and Nilsen was questioned about the encounter. Dennis simply denied that anything happened, and Andrew declined to press charges. After the first murder, Dennis was hoping that the dark urges would not return, but the monster inside him was not satisfied. In December 1979, 23-year-old Kenneth Ockenden was on holiday in England. He would be flying back to Canada soon, so when Dennis Nilsen offered to take him sightseeing around London, he accepted. They went to all the famous landmarks, and Dennis suggested they go back to his flat for dinner and drinks. Dennis really liked Ken and didn't want him to leave and go back to Canada. Dennis wrote in his autobiography that he learned how to tell when his victims, quote, vacated the premises. So it was after they soiled themselves that he would begin his disturbing ritual. When Dennis finished strangling Kenneth with a headphone cable, he dragged him to the tub to wash him. He laid Ken on the bed and held him for a while, then put him in a closet until the following day. Dennis dressed Ken in socks, underwear, and a vest, powdering him to prepare him for a twisted photo shoot. Afterwards, he laid down on the bed and put Ken's body on top of his own, and watched a few of his favorite TV shows. He once again performed lewd acts, then wrapped Ken up, placing him beneath the floorboards again. Over the next 2 weeks, he would bring Ken out to watch TV with him. Sometimes he would have Ken on his lap, and he would compliment Ken on his beautiful skin and impressive physique. He ended these nights by saying goodnight to Ken before washing and wrapping him back up to put him under the floor again. Martin Duffy was a 16-year-old runaway who had hitchhiked to London without telling his parents. He had no place to stay and spent the night on the streets near a train station. He was starving and exhausted when he met Dennis Nilsen, who offered him a warm meal and a comfortable bed. No one ever saw Martin Duffy again. The police tended not to investigate disappearances like this with as much urgency. Just one of the many people in the care system, homeless, addicted to drugs, or mentally ill. 23-year-old Malcolm Barlow was feeling unwell on September 17, 1981. The side effects of his epilepsy medication sometimes made him feel weak and shaky. On Melrose Avenue, his legs gave out on him, but luckily a nice man with a Scottish accent helped him up. The man brought Malcolm up to his flat and called 999 for an ambulance. When Malcolm was released the next day, he returned to 195 Melrose Avenue to say thank you to the man who had helped him. He accepted the offer of a meal and a cocktail. He really wasn't supposed to mix his medication with alcohol, and after finishing the cocktail, he fell asleep on the couch. Billy Sutherland was a male escort who had recently been released from prison. His last client was a tall, skinny Scottish man who paid him well. Billy promised his mother he would call regularly, but he missed their weekly call. His mother reported him missing, but the police did not seem to care. Billy was one of about 40 other missing men named Billy Sutherland, and one of hundreds of young gay men who vanished in London. The city was a dangerous place for people like Billy, who lived on the margins of society. The police had more pressing cases to deal with than the disappearances of gay men. The situation under the floorboards was becoming an issue for Dennis. He had to spray for bugs every day and use odor-eliminating sticks all around the flat. Not to mention he was running out of room. It was time for another bonfire. He had to figure out a way to make transportation more manageable due to the collection he had accumulated. He needed to downsize. He told himself that it was just like butchering a cow, like when he was a cook in the army. He grabbed a bottle of whiskey and would sip from it often while he worked. Sometimes he couldn't help but vomit from the smell and the bugs. He tried to kill them with salt or wash them away. He took the smaller parts and wrapped them in plastic. They took up less room under the floorboards now. He placed the larger parts in suitcases and travel bags and stored those in the shed. The internal parts he threw over the fence into the woodsy area behind the property. The animals would take care of the rest. When he was ready for another bonfire, it was much easier to gradually add the bags and suitcases to the flames. In 1981, the landlord of 195 Melrose decided to renovate the building, so all the tenants had to vacate. Dennis didn't want to leave, and the landlord had to buy his lease out before he finally agreed. Dennis had one last bonfire the day before he moved out. 23 Cranley Gardens was an attic flat, and the lack of floorboards in the flat made things impractical for Dennis at first, but that wouldn't hold him back for very long. Some of Nilsen's companions walked away from these flats without a scratch. Some were there for casual encounters, others for just dinner and drinks. Carl Stoddard wasn't so lucky. He met Dennis, and after a night of heavy drinking at Dennis's flat, Carl blacked out. When he woke up, his head was pounding and he couldn't breathe. As he drifted in and out of consciousness, he heard water running and realized that Dennis was trying to drown him, but he was so weak he basically gave up struggling. Dennis's later account of the failed attempt is very different than what's in the official report, but it's generally agreed that something snapped Dennis out of his murderous trance and he revived Carl. Dennis later told Carl that he had injured himself on the zipper of a sleeping bag and that he had revived him and cared for him for a few days. He put Carl on a train home, and bizarrely, he also asked Carl if they could see each other again. Despite this terrifying encounter, Carl chose not to involve the police, saying he simply didn't want any trouble. Paul Nobbs, Toshimitsu Osawa, and Douglas Stewart were among the others who were lucky enough to escape. John Howlett, Graham Allen, and Stephen Sinclair were not so lucky. They never left Cranley Gardens, at least not in the state that they were when they arrived. Dennis had no floorboards in this flat, just a bath, a wardrobe, and some cabinet space in the kitchen. There was no yard where he could burn his rubbish. The only way to remove waste from the flat was the septic system. After working for a while, Dennis started to realize how long it would take to flush everything down the toilet. He thought of the large cooking pot he had bought years ago. Dennis began to boil some water, and in the pots he placed different parts of his victims, cooking them until there was nothing left but bone. In February 1983, a plumber was called to Cranley Gardens on a complaint of clogged drains. When the plumber lifted the manhole cover, he was met with the most horrific thing he had ever seen. He knew from the smell what he was looking at and contacted the police. On February 9, 1983, detectives knocked on Dennis Nilsen's door, telling him they were there to ask him about his drains. As the police stepped into Nilsen's flat, they were immediately hit by the unmistakable odor of decomposition. Nilsen asked why the police had an interest in his drains, and the police revealed the blockage had been caused by human remains. Nilsen's feigned shock and denial were cut short when the detective demanded to know the location of the rest of the body. Unfazed, Nilsen admitted that the remaining parts were stored in plastic bags tucked away in a nearby wardrobe. When the officers saw the size of the bags, they asked Nilsen if there were any more hidden body parts. Nilsen responded by saying it was a long story and pledged to reveal everything at the police station. As they drove, the officers questioned Dennis if the remains in the flat belonged to one or two individuals.
I said, "Are we talking about one body or two?" And he just turned round and looked at me and he said, 15 or 16.
In subsequent interviews, Dennis was able to clarify the details of 13 murders and at least 7 attempts. Some names he remembered, some he said he never even knew. He had nicknames for some and knew the general time frames of all of the incidents. He said that sometimes he went to bed drunk and woke up with a dead man next to him. He recalled using a ligature on some occasions and said he blacked out at other times. However, when asked about how these men came to be dissected and burned or flushed, he recounted those events in great detail. He was held on suspicion of murder, and when Stephen Sinclair's remains were positively identified, he was then charged with murder. By the time his trial date arrived, the investigation had uncovered additional evidence, and Dennis Nilsen was charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder. He initially was going to plead guilty to all charges, but after firing his lawyer and retaining a new one, he was prepared to plead not guilty by reason of diminished responsibility. Diminished responsibility is a defense strategy aimed at reducing a defendant's criminal liability due to impaired mental faculties. This type of defense is only applicable to the types of offenses which require proof of a specific mindset, for example, first-degree murder, which needs to be shown to be premeditated. It doesn't result in total acquittal, but it can lessen the severity of the charge, such as downgrading it to second-degree murder or manslaughter. This defense differs from pleading insanity, which requires the defense to demonstrate the suspect didn't have the capacity to understand the implications or illegality of their actions. Nilsen's lawyer was aiming to have the charges reduced to manslaughter and provided expert witnesses who testified that Nilsen had an unspecified personality disorder. He called it borderline false self as if pseudo-normal narcissistic personality disorder with occasional outbreaks of schizoid disturbances. Some of the behaviors that Nilsen exhibits are from all over the psychiatric disorder spectrum, including paranoia, grandiose thinking, depersonalization and disassociation, and apathy. This defense did not succeed in swaying the jury, and Nilsen was convicted by a 10-2 majority on 6 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder, and a unanimous verdict of guilty on the other attempted murder charge. In the UK, the criminal justice system often pushes for verdicts that are unanimous, but they're also willing to accept verdicts based on majority agreement. Dennis Nilsen was sentenced to serve life in prison with a minimum of 25 years.
Dennis Nilsen, the man who once called himself the murderer of the century, tonight starts a life sentence for 6 murders in North London. He once boasted he could have killed 500 people had he not been stopped. The judge at the Old Bailey said he should stay in prison for at least 25 years.
This was converted to a whole life order in 1994. He did not try to appeal. He had no issue occupying himself in prison. Based on good behavior, he was given supplies to make art and even had 2 pet birds. He wrote an unpublished autobiography and did a TV interview where he recounted his past, his perception of himself, and his crimes in graphic detail. He even brought a complaint to the European Court of Human Rights. Apparently, removing the more graphic images from the magazines he subscribed to was a violation of his human rights. In the early morning hours of May 10, 2018, Dennis awoke with severe abdominal pain and was transported to the hospital. He had a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm, and though emergency surgery repaired it, he died 2 days later from a blood clot. In 2021, his autobiography, The History of a Drowning Boy, was published, edited by his friend and confidant, Mark Austin. Some of the evidence from the crime scenes are even in the Crime Museum of New Scotland Yard. It's not open to the public. It's used as a teaching aid for government and police personnel to study criminology. His stove and bathtub are among the items in the collection. Do you think there were signs of Nilsen's monstrous nature that were blatantly overlooked? What could have been done to intervene and potentially save his victims from their cruel fates? Share your views and theories in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. If you or someone you know are facing challenges regarding sexual orientation or gender identity, please know that you are not alone. There are many organizations and hotlines that can provide you with confidential and affirming support. Remember, you are valid. You are loved. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this case and found it interesting. If you did, please consider liking the video and subscribing to my channel for more true crime stories. As always, feel free to share your thoughts and feedback in the comments section below. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you again, and be sure to join us next time as we explore the stories hidden within, the wrinkles in crime.